Welcome all, and thanks for tuning in again for another episode of the Build Me a Brewery podcast. This is part 4 and our final episode of the brewery equipment sourcing segment. Today's episode, I chat with Gavin van Vurren from Synergy Custom Solutions. Originally from South Africa and another IT industry convert, Gavin spent too many years in IT project management, which began to eat away at his sanity. And through a friend, he discovered brewing, distilling and packaging equipment and fell in love with the industry. Now, Synergy Custom Solutions provide complete brewery consulting and equipment services for the brewery industry and are an approved supplier of Tiantai brewing equipment, which was the Chinese manufacturer and supplier that the Black Ops boys started out on in their brewery journey. Following suit with other episodes in this segment on the types of equipment and important considerations for brewery layout, etc., Gav also dives into some important details around freight considerations when dealing with overseas manufacturers as well. So I'll leave you all to it then. I hope you enjoy my chat with Gavin van Vurren from Synergy Custom Solutions. Well, welcome Gavin to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. Thanks for coming on, mate.
Thank you.
Now, Gav, you're based up in Brisbane, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, north of Brisbane.
Yeah. Yes, and you head up a company called Synergy Custom Solutions.
That's correct, Chris.
Excellent. And how I actually got introduced to you, I think in an earlier episode I mentioned to Neil Cameron a bit about, I was on the wrong path of asking the question about equipment a little bit too early in the brewery planning piece. Always got fixated on what sort of brew house I wanted rather than actually figuring out what premises or actual location I was going to put it all in. So I guess it makes sense to have that all in place before engaging or discussing the equipment side of things. But we were talking and, you mentioned that a lot of the equipment you source comes from overseas and, you provided me a bit of content around, all the different equipment that, a brewery needs and, some quotations, etc. So we'll definitely go into more about what an aspiring brewery owner needs to consider when it comes to equipment, etc. But just to kick things off, mate, tell us a bit about your background and what you were doing before Synergy and brewery equipment supply.
Well, I'm an African, and you can tell by the color of my skin. No, I'm kidding. That's the first thing people look at when I say I'm African. You get this quizzical look on their face. Yeah. I actually did my time in the IT industry. So I've been in project management, project and program management for more years than I want to tell you about. Probably about 30 years. I really just got full of it and was starting to look at something else. I got into packaging about 4 years ago, working for a friend of mine. So he was looking for a sale and I knew I could sell because I've been selling myself for many years. I've been contracting for the last 22 years in Australia. And I said, yeah, sure, I can sell stuff. And I actually went into the packaging industry with absolutely no knowledge whatsoever about what could package what. I had no idea that there is a machine for every single thing that you want to do in your life. And my boss's approach was, go out and make me rich. So, sell whatever you can and, give me some basics and put me on the road. So I quickly found out that the packaging industry is so vast that I just couldn't sell everything. And quite by mistake, I found myself involved in supplying brewing and canning equipment to craft breweries. I really, really liked the atmosphere that the guys worked in. I liked the way that people talked to each other. I liked the way that people started, I started to get a feel for brewers and brewery owners sharing stuff, even down to recipes and talking to each other and getting together and having, piss-ups every now and then, and just basically socializing together. So this became my niche, and I really started to sell canning equipment at first because breweries were, I'm not a brewer by trade. I know a little bit about brewing. I know quite a lot about brewing equipment. I have resources behind me that are the experts, and that's the way I used to do my project management. I don't profess to be an expert in everything, and I don't want to be. A lot of the time I use experts. I'm very good at production, equipment, canning machines, pre-canning machines, post-canning machines, all that whole line. I'm pretty good in brewing. In brewing equipment. And that's where I am now. So nearly 3 years ago, I started my own business, and we're starting to really gather momentum. I went overseas and did a lot of research on manufacturers and taking into account people's reviews over here, talking to brewers, and ended up pretty much selling solely for Tiantai from China, because out of the 3 manufacturers that we picked that we could choose from, depending on what equipment we wanted, Tiantai have been the most solid, responsive. They have good work ethic, so they keep all their workers happy, which means that their turnover is not big, which means that their quality is good.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of listeners would probably be aware of Tiantai. They do come up a lot in the Australian market for equipment supply from China. I think we're talking off air just a bit about the Black Ops guys, and they've been very public about the supplier they used, and that was Tiantai. And so that's essentially the manufacturer that you tend to, as your go-to for bringing that over here for Australian brewery builds. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah. So they're Black Ops in particular, they have a pretty old design in their HQ, which is still going flat strap, and they've had no problems with it literally for years.
Okay. So I guess, like I was saying, we'll definitely get stuck into more about, what equipment people need to consider, and also how to approach, especially engaging suppliers from overseas. I think a lot of people will get a lot out of that sort of content. But you mentioned that you're not a big brewer, but you obviously know a lot in the brewing equipment space. Are you a big craft drinker?
I am definitely an avid craft beer drinker.
Excellent.
In a past life, I used to drink quite a lot of beer. I progressed to kind of got away from beer when I came to Australia. Started drinking wine and bourbon, not in the same glass, but and whiskey. When I started getting into the craft beer industry, I found that there was just so much taste and flavor out there. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and if you were to mention one or two favorite breweries or beers of yours,
there's so many different beers that I do like. I went to Belgium quite a few years ago and tasted the Trappist beers made by the monks over there. You probably come across Leffe and a couple of other things, Bellevue, and I really became a huge fan of porters and stouts. But I've actually grown to like IPAs. I'm an IPA fanatic. I love IPAs, double IPAs, triple IPAs. But when you start drinking the stronger beers, I go to sleep very quickly. So I normally try, if I'm going to have quite a few beers with, in a session, I'll start off with something light. I'll start off with a session ale or something like that.
Yeah.
And I've grown to learn about lagers, because I wasn't a great lager fan. But one of the guys up in the Sunshine Coast, one of the brewers, I worked with him for a couple of days. He was telling me about how many lagers there are in the world today, and tasting some of the different lagers he makes has turned me around. So I'm a big lager fan too.
Yeah, and there's a lot of new styles coming on the market now. That lagers have traditionally had a bit of in the craft beer space, this bad reputation as being too clean and flavourless. And now there's this big push for sort of reinventing the flavour profile for lagers from what I'm hearing. I know the Australian brewery who I had on earlier in the podcast, Dan, they're making Mexican lagers, and there's all these different lagers coming out in the market, so it's really good to hear. But I guess getting into more the nitty-gritty side of things, and can you tell us a bit more exactly what the bread and butter of what Synergy do and the services you offer?
Well, so we're primarily suppliers of brewing, distilling, and production line equipment. Okay, where we try and our point of difference is we try and have value-add services. So we provide a door-to-door shipping service, for instance. So when you order something, we take care of that whole thing. We take it off your hands. The goods are manufactured, and when they get on the ship and when they arrive at your doorstep, you rely on us to get it there, and we communicate with you every step of the way, so that when the stuff arrives, you're ready for it.
Yeah. Okay.
We typically, our bread and butter is brew houses and canning machines. We sell canning machines from Twin Monkeys out in the States, they do some really innovative stuff, and we like working with them. They're very easy to work with. One thing about the people we deal with is I like people who are easy to talk to. I like people who listen, and supply, and manufacturers who are prepared to just go a little, do a little bit extra to give the customers a custom build or something that makes their lives a little bit easier. Willing to listen, willing to innovate. So that's a big thing with us. And we also provide other services, like, for instance, if you want a cold room, if you want fabrication services, for instance, there's always pipe work to be done when the brewery is installed. So we can do that. We can provide specialized gas installations, like a type B gas for gas burners, for instance. We also have a relationship with a design and construction company. So we use them to provide venue design and construction. So there's quite a few services that we offer that are a little bit more broad-minded, I guess, than your average equipment supplier.
Yeah, and I guess and sorry to interrupt you there, Gav, but I guess a lot of aspiring brewery owners tend to forget, and I probably didn't consider this when I first started asking the question about equipment, is, you see a price tag online, or you get a quote from someone via an email that you've been talking to either overseas or here in Australia, and that's just the purchase of the equipment. There's much more money to be spent on actually getting it over to Australia if it's coming from overseas, in the freight costs. And then there's also, price tags on getting it installed and commissioned and all that. So I'd like you to sort of break that down for us later on in our conversation. But what would an aspiring brewery owner have to consider in terms, if they were to make a list of equipment that they need at a minimum? Could you give us a bit of a rundown of some of the most important aspects of the brew house and equipment that the modern day brewery will need?
Well, I think probably the point to start off with is you need to have an idea of what your operation is going to look like. How much beer do you think you're going to need to produce? Once you have an idea of the amount of beer you'd need in a week, for instance, or in a month, we can apply that to formula and produce a brewery, for instance, a brew house size, and fermenters, possibly bright tank, and clean in place machinery that you'd need in a brewery. So you need a brew house. Which is can be in different configurations, right from a 4-vessel brewery down to a 2-vessel brewery. So and the smaller brew houses incorporate different functions into less tanks. For instance, you could get a mash lauter tun instead of a mash tun and a lauter tun in 2 different tanks, for instance. And that's kind of how they vary. The smaller systems tend to incorporate different functions into a smaller amount of tanks. You get a smaller brew deck. You get the whole system is more compact and obviously on a smaller scale. So on top of that, so fermenters, bright tanks, if you're going to be serving from tank, you need something to clean your system with, so clean in place, a chiller, definitely a keg washer, maybe not a filler, but definitely a keg washer. Then once you've got an idea of the equipment you need for your actual brewing operation, you need to start looking at things like, where you're going to store your beer. You need a cold room, right? You need a cold room either to store just beer in kegs, so behind your tap system, and you may be looking at a bigger operation where you've got 200 or 300 kegs that you're going to fill in the amount of beer that you're producing in a month. So you need a separate cold room or a bigger cold room to house those kegs and keep them cold. Then how are you going to dispense the beer? You need a dispensing system. So that's obviously going to go behind your bar, and that's where most of the money is. Dispensing beer straight out of keg or out of the tank into a keg, into a glass is the most efficient way of selling beer, and it's where your biggest profit lies. A lot of the guys know this, but putting beer into cans is a little bit more expensive. You can get bigger volumes out. You can get it out to a wider audience. But if you're doing a smaller operation, dispensing over a bar is the way to go.
Yeah, and that's the impression I've got from a lot of the brewery owners. Your biggest margins that you can make, especially starting out, and if you are a small operation, is in your taproom sales.
Yeah.
And, and especially if you're starting out at a small level, you probably don't have it in your budget to afford a canning line straight away, probably not in the first 12 months. So a lot of these mobile canning services like East Coast Canning, and they tend to come in and help brewery startups get their beer from their tanks into packaging, which once again eats into their margin on the very small margin that they have in can sales. Am I talking pretty much or making sense there as to, is that the way it's lined up? Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What people tend to find is, for the interim, at least while you're growing, the mobile cannings people are really great, and some of them do an awesome job. When you start getting into a bit more volume and you start relying on the mobile canning guys a bit more, you might find that they can't accommodate you when you need them to accommodate you. So your control is not over your own destiny as far as that's concerned. You are reliant upon the mobile canning guys. And then you're reliant on their equipment being 100% maintained, the losses, the dissolved oxygen, all that kind of thing. You're reliant on them to make your beer in cans the best it can be. So at some point, it starts to make a little bit more sense to get your own line, but that could be years down the track. I wouldn't rush into something like that unless you know that your market is just going to take off and nobody knows that.
And some of these canning lines, speaking to other brewery owners, they're almost as much as the brew house to put together. Some of the decent ones on the market. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah. Oh, look, it depends. I mean, if you're looking at a very small brew house, the Twin Monkeys models go from the smallest one, which is about 53 grand US, to the biggest one, which is just around 80. So they're not as expensive as a brew house, but you've got to look at what it's going to give you. So what it's going to give you is some independence. It's going to give you the ability to get your beers into cans when you want to do them. You've got your own labor to talk about. If you buy a really efficient machine, a canning machine can be run by 3 people. You've got one watching the thaw, you've got one making sure the cans are loaded, and you've maybe got one doing the packaging at the end, if it's not automated. So, it's a question of control, but it's also a question of how you see your business growing, and just having a look a bit into the future about how much it's costing you to have your beer canned with a mobile canning guy, and what your return on your investment is going to be if you buy your own.
Yeah, and that's good. No, well, that's great, because there is a couple episodes later on in this podcast series where I'm hoping to get Chris Kelly from East Coast Canning on to share some insights about the mobile canning side, and so I guess we'll dive more into. Yeah, he sounds, spoken to him on the phone. I'm hoping to catch up with him next Friday, actually. But so you've already given a bit of advice already about when it comes to starting out and sourcing equipment. What do you see as the most common mistakes or things that are overlooked by brewery owners when thinking about purchasing their equipment?
Okay, I'm going to say a little phrase quite often. Don't rush into anything. Okay. Do your homework when you are comparing, because obviously everybody shops around. If you're a dummy, if you don't shop around, when you're having a look around, take a close look at what you're getting in your quotations, and try and compare apples with apples, because there will be people, there's salesmen out there all over the place will try and sell you on some particular feature, which you may or may not need. That particular feature may not be on another quote, but you may not need it. So if you just have a look at what you've got and make sure you're comparing apples with apples, because that gives you the most information to make an informed decision. And that's what I go through with quite a lot of my clients is have a look at this, make your informed decision. I don't care whether you go, I do care, but I don't care whether you go with somebody else, but just as long as you've done the homework the way that you should. The second thing is really speak to other people in the business. Talk to other brewers. There's so many guys out there that share information, and you're doing this for a huge audience already, and just speak to them about suppliers. Because one of the things that I did when I first came back from China to have a look at manufacturers is I came back and spoke to a whole of Tiantai customers who I'd never seen before because obviously they were before my time, and asked them things like, how did they treat you? How did they treat you to start off with? How did they treat you once the gear was in? If you had a problem, what happened? Did they send somebody out? Did they call you? Did they wait 5 days? Did they run away? And I've heard some weird stories about some of the other manufacturers, but so these are the kinds of things that you're going to need to know. What happens if you have a problem? You can't put this together, or somebody's put it together. The brew house is working. You've done your first couple of brews and something falls over. Then what happens? You need to be able to, for somebody to be able to either fix your problem on the phone or get on a plane or jump in a car and come out and fix it. So those are the things that are going to hurt you. When you've got commitments to, maybe a distributor for your beer and they want so many cartons or so many pallets out yesterday and you've got a breakdown. You need somebody who's going to be there to fix it. So it's got a lot to do with integrity and reliability and kind of sustainability in your business. And this the same goes with canning machines. Same goes with any of the machinery that you buy. And also when you're looking around on the internet, beware of internet reviews. Some of them are bought. That's why I like people to speak to people because you get news firsthand. Not all internet reviews are true. One of the other things is, educate yourself on the business side of your venture. I mean, not all of us are businessmen, right? So, if you know what to expect from actually, running the business side, you might be a brewer with a small brewery who's also got to do your books. You've got to do your social media, your marketing. So you're looking at social media, you're looking at mail shots, you're looking at posters, you're looking at, a whole squadrillion of things. If you could put yourself in the driving seat for a typical day, you'll get a good idea of just how much work there is in front of you and whether you need to employ somebody or get help from. That's another thing to think about. You don't have to start out big. I mean, Richard Branson is a prime example. You don't have to start out big, but you should plan for expansion. At least sometime in the future, create a couple of what-if scenarios. So what if in 6 months' time or a year's time, I'm so flat-strapped for beer, I've got to go and, store my beer somewhere else. Where am I going to put my new tanks? How do I ferment the stuff? Where do I store it? So if you've got a plan, that's better than nothing.
So planning for that expansion. Yeah, and that has been a theme as well that I think Pat and people like Pete as well, Pete from Wayward and Pat from Willie, they mentioned that, if they were to do it all again, they would have started out bigger or would have had a lot more money behind them because they didn't really take into account or didn't expect the demand so early on, and they were just chasing their tail for the first 12 months. And it's a lot cheaper to expand or reinvest in your equipment if you were expecting to do it at a certain time rather than just hoping for the best, get a bit of fan base, and then we'll think about expanding. I guess if you know where, especially your brewery layout as well, from what I'm understanding, if you plan for expanding to a certain space in your brewery at some point down the track, that you're better off rather than sort of trying to Tetris it in later on.
Oh, exactly. There are things that we can do. We can stack tanks and stuff like that, but it doesn't always work. I mean, we're not magicians, right? And I've seen things like this happen. I've come across a couple of brewers they just want a nice small brewery, a small little food shop, a restaurant or something. They just want the business to tick along. They're not interested in expanding. It's too much work, blah, 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 blah. The next thing, you win a couple of awards. People who've never heard of you before, hear a podcast, or read an article, taste your beers. There you are in all your glory, wondering how the heck you're going to meet bloody public demand now that you're famous. What are you going to do now? Those kinds of things can happen very easily. I've come across quite a few people who look for second-hand equipment. It's appealing in the sense that it's probably cheap and, somebody's used it, so it must be okay. But who wants their first beer to fail because of mold growing in a dodgy well somewhere, in an obscure part of your system? And how the hell do you find it? Do you know what I mean? And it doesn't take much more than that to spoil a beer. So if you consider that, if you've got plans to do thorough things and have, proper inspection and get some, maybe a camera or something up into piping systems and that, then that's fine. But, just be careful of second-hand equipment. Other people don't treat equipment like you want to.
And I forget his name, but he wrote a very famous book. I think it was called The Franken Brew.
Okay.
He's a gentleman from the States. And yeah, he basically talks about how, if you're handy on the tools, maybe got a bit of a fabrication background or a couple of buddies who have those sort of skill sets, people basically piecing together equipment from here, there and everywhere. I think even Pat from Willie mentioned they started out on, secondhand dairy equipment and they converted them into a brewery system. And I think he said if he were to do it all again, they probably wouldn't go down that path. But that's the only budget they had at that time. It served them well, but it was a very raw system. It wasn't automated. It was very manual intensive. And I guess that's what aspiring brewery owners need to determine, whether are they prepared to pay that extra money to make their lives a little bit easier in the beginning, to allow them to do double and triple batches and improve efficiencies, or if money is definitely a problem, which is going to be the most case for a lot of people listening and wanting to go down this route, is can you hack out, the 15, 16 hour plus days trying to do a double batch when, we maybe could have spent a few tens of thousands of dollars in the beginning just to make your life a little bit easier and a bit more automated.
Yeah, exactly. Because everybody wants a life, right? So your love of making beer and seeing your customers' faces and, wow, really good stuff and all that, it's one thing. But most people have lives outside the brewery. So you also have to look at that balance.
And we touched on it earlier a bit about physical premises and location considerations, but can you touch on a few important considerations for people starting out when purchasing equipment? So, brewery layout, the footprint of your brewery, the available space. I've had other breweries come on and say, consider your ceilings, consider the weight of the floors, the type of floors, the drainage. Any thoughts you'd like to share on those considerations?
Look, I think as far as I think market research, if we go back to market research and what you're going to expect from your brewery in terms of what people's demands are for beer, you get a feel for what size brewery you want. When you start looking for premises, you should have that in mind because, and also when you decide, these premises look awesome. It's at the right spot. It's the right this. It's that. You can put the venue over there and the kitchen goes over there, blah, blah, blah. Take the time out before you sign the lease and get hold of your favorite brewery supplier and say, hey, look, can we fit the brewery we want into the space? And if we can't, how much space do we need? Because you don't want to get in there and have to cram everything into a corner because where are you going to work? What is your brewing life going to be like? And what happens when you expand? So, and definitely get hold of a good builder who will help you understand whether the premises that you're considering are suitable to house your equipment. So, we've actually just come from a customer not so long ago that who had to put a lot of reinforcing into a floor to hold the brewery because they had a basement underneath. It cost them a lot of money, and it's a lot of money that they didn't account for. So most definitely consider how big your tanks are, your mash tun, your kettle, your lauter tun, your fermenters, everything, your keg washer. And when you consider weight, when you do your calculations, make sure that you calculate with everything full, all your kegs, your kitchen, everything. Make it full in your head and then calculate it because then you'll have a total weight for the floor and then add some on top, add some fat and speak to the builder to confirm.
I forget which episode it was, but we talked briefly about the type of floors. I think it was with the Rocks guys, Simon and Addy, and they were talking a bit about epoxy and I think petrified tile. I think it's called a brewer's tile. Do you come across much in that sort of space about a lot of breweries starting out considering these sort of things?
Yeah, definitely. The brewery I just spoke about is epoxy on their brewery floor, so it definitely has to be food grade. You have to speak to your council and make sure that they are happy with what kind of floors you have because with this particular brewery, the council dictated what floors they would have. They also had issues with drainage So, for instance, they couldn't use the same drainage for their kitchen as they used for the brewery. They had to put in a whole separate system.
Mm.
So, these are things that I never knew before. And now I can, when I go out to a site, I can say, hey, look, do you know about this drainage thing? You'll also have things like a cold room. If you put a cold room in a place, that's actually quite a heavy piece of, not equipment, but it's got walls, it's got a heavy door, it's got refrigeration unit in it. So that all comes into what's resting on your floor, especially when you go into things I was just about to talk about, heritage listed buildings. Before I go into that, something that's just come to mind, remember that if you're going to have a brew pub or a restaurant, you've got patrons on the floor too. How many patrons do you think you're going to put in there? And how much do they weigh? So there's a lot of things to consider. If you put your mind into your operation when it's operating and you say, oh, what does this look like? There's patrons over there. Hey, we've got 100 people in here. There's my beer tanks are all full. My kegs are all full. And then you get a picture in your head for what you have to consider.
Yeah, good advice. Now, we spoke a bit about sourcing equipment from overseas and obviously Synergy predominantly are sourcing equipment or providing equipment from Tiantai. I know that you said off air that there's a few others that you tend to use, but Tiantai seem to be the most reliable in your opinion. Are you able to give myself and listeners some advice or some important considerations on sourcing equipment from overseas? So how to determine quality manufacturers from the poor ones. I've heard people using supply brokers, equipment brokers. Pete from Wayward said he went to mainland China and went and visited 20 plus factories. He had a translator. Are you able to give some advice when dealing with Chinese manufacturers or overseas manufacturers?
I think one of the big things is don't believe what you see on the internet, because there are so many good websites out there, and when you actually get to the factories, they're nothing like what the website depicts.
Yeah.
Pete from Wayward probably had a good idea, but going to 20 factories is a big trip. It's a big trip. It's costly, and unless you have a plan in your head, and you probably did with some criteria, it's really difficult to get a handle on who's actually going to produce what you want. Because even if you go to shows, these guys will pitch up there and they'll have some gear that they'll take to the show, and they'll put it all together and it'll look nice and shiny and all the wheels will be great and everything will be hunky-dory. But you don't always get that when they produce your piece of equipment, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you see even at shows is not always what you get. But one of the things that we had some really basic criteria that we were looking at when we went out over to China. One of them was, how easy is it to, talk to these guys? If their English is so bad that they can't talk to you, how do you communicate a change or customization or, anything, a problem, for instance, or shipping or whatever? The other thing is, are they willing to customize? If they're not willing to customize, why won't you take somebody on that's going to give you something you don't want? When you have a look at their factory, have a look at how many people they have in there, how big the factory is, whether their production line is actually segmented. So, for instance, the first piece of sheet metal is done in this area, the next piece, the rolling is done in that area, the welding is done in that area, and it's segmented. Watch how they work. I've watched these. I've seen some of these guys work without welding shields. They're doing stainless steel or welding with no eye protection.
Wow.
They haven't got ear protection. They don't have gloves. Then you have a look at the general working conditions. Is it really dirty? Is it, some of them are pretty much dingy little factory holes. And how do you keep staff in working conditions like that? Which means that, as I said previously, high turnover of staff has got to affect your quality. How do you get the new guys to get back up to the kind of quality that you would expect? So those are a few really sort of basic criteria that we took with us to find out what kind of quality they produce. You really have to have as far as in my head anyway, you have to have a technical person who's okay with things like stainless steel welding and what it looks like and what it should look like and how they passivate it and how they pickle it, and make sure that the end product is food safe.
And just talking about you mostly dealing with the sales team when you're engaging with one of these manufacturers from overseas, let's say China, and they're very responsive in the sales process, I've heard, and I've even seen it from, getting pestered on LinkedIn, and even with just marketing this podcast, I'm starting to get hit left, right and center about it all. But, and that's fine. That's fair enough. I mean, I'm collating a lot of the information and trying to, I'm going to sit down eventually and work it all out. But yeah, they seem really responsive and available in the lead up to when you finally give them your credit card details and you pay. But then I hear people say that once that money's in their account, getting them on the phone. This isn't with everyone, but the after sales service and the lead up to the delivery of your brew house can be very poor. And I guess that's why people are quite prepared to pay more money for peace of mind dealing with someone from, say, the States or Europe or, someone like Germany.
Yeah.
What's I don't want to make this episode a plug for Tiantai, but, you seem to have a very high opinion of them. And how would you describe their after sales service and follow up?
Look, I think that's easy to answer. And the answer is, whoever wants to know about that needs to speak to some of the Tiantai customers, because, I can plug it as much as I want. But if you get it from a horse's mouth, they're not going to lie to you. I know for a fact that they are very willing to replace damaged parts, for instance. Somebody gets their stuff delivered and it's got a couple of breaking gauges or something, or, solenoid doesn't work. They literally just put it on the plane the next day. And you can't fault service like that. Yeah. One of the other things to take into account when you're doing, popped into my head, when you're doing your calculations for getting your budget together, is when you go to most, I'm not sure about the US guys, but I know that most Chinese manufacturers, they'll give you a shipping price. Okay. And the shipping price is fair enough, but it's normally in shipping terms, it's a FOB price, which means they give you the price to get the goods to the ship in China. Okay. They can offer you a sea freight price as well, which is fine. And that's normally reasonable. But what they don't tell you is when it gets to this side, that's where a whole lot of costs jump in. And you're looking at things like, if you're in rural Victoria or rural anywhere, you'll have tailgate inspection, and that's mandatory. You've got quarantine, you've got paperwork, all these documentation, even down to things like booking a truck, booking a berth at the dock. There are costs there that most people don't realize. So you need to take that into account as well. So sometimes when you get a shipping quote from us, oh, look at that. We can get it cheaper just to the Chinese guys. Just beware.
So Gav, you will actually handle the entire process from dealing with the supplier, the finalizing the deal, and then organizing the shipping and logistics of getting it to Australia and then eventually to wherever the brewery is located. And
absolutely.
And it's that shipping and freight side that I have absolutely no clue. Going through this, I'm like, shit, you've got to consider freight. You've got to consider, the time spent takes to either build it and get sent over here. And then the Australian government, quarantining it and AOKing it for then eventually being sent out into wherever it's got to go in the country. Yeah. There's so many things that you just don't think of. It's not as simple as, I want that piece of equipment. That's a nice photo or stainless steel online. And, I'm going to have that in my brewery one day. And it sounds like a bloody mammoth journey for it to come all that way and to eventually start making beer.
Well, the thing is, if you look at just recent occurrences in Australia, they had a whole lot of dock strikes and, strike action all over Australian docks, which creates, ships aren't able to offload, for instance, which creates congestion. So that's a stopping point. If they have a dock strike in Taipei, that'll be a stopping point. They have bad weather along the way. These typhoons that are hitting the coast now, that's another thing. Sometimes they just cancel shipments. They cancel routes. And you don't know that. But being in contact with my shipping broker, who's in contact with the shipping line, I'm able to get back to the customer and say, hey, look, there's been a delay of a week because there's just congestion all along that route. Then when it gets here, you have things like you wait for the quarantine guys. The quarantine can be booked and they'll come whenever they want to come. It could be today, could be a couple of days, could be a week. And when the goods actually gets on the truck, to go to the premises, you got to decide whether you want a truck that has, if it's a smaller piece of equipment and it's a live load, you make sure you've got a forklift there and a couple of guys to help you, and you actually put it off the truck while it waits for you. And you've got 1 hour. After that hour, they start charging you per hour extra. And that's the cartage people. Then you can even have things like a side loader where they'll actually drop off the container and come back and fetch it a bit later. And that's a different price. So you can take your time, get your goods off. And, so there's a lot of things, a lot of logistics to take into account. And unless you know your way around it, you can get bamboozled really easily.
Yeah, but I'm going to say straight away, I'm not the person that would like to outsource stuff, because I know that in me starting this brewery is going to cost a lot of money. So I need as much of my pennies in my pocket as possible. But when it comes to dealing with the shipping side and the freight side, if I went through something like you, Gav, I'd get you to handle the entire shit. I could not. I don't think I could handle all that with the amount of other stuff that would be going on at that time. I mean, if there's people that are a bit more organised and know what they're doing, then absolutely. But for the average Joe who just doesn't know anything with logistics and freight, I think it's good money spent to just let you handle all that side of things, because it sounds like there's a lot of headache.
Oh, there's a lot of headache. I mean, I come from a project management background, so I'm used to headaches. But can you imagine you've got all your gear ready to come, it's hit port, it's about to be delivered, and it's supposed to come today, and you hire a whole lot of people to come and help you pull all the tanks off, and you hire a crane to put it in the building and stuff, and the truck has a breakdown. And you don't know it has breakdown because the truckie doesn't know how to contact you, and you don't know how to contact the truckie. And he's got to contact his base, who hopefully will contact the shipping agent, who hopefully will contact you. So you might have people sitting out there for half a day being paid for nothing. And we take that away. So we communicate all that stuff all the time.
Slightly going off topic, but when I was looking at your website a couple of weeks back, I noticed that you also offer some assistance to aspiring brewery owners about business plans.
Correct.
We've talked a little bit about business plans in the podcast. Like, people have said, you definitely need one. And I know that I'll be definitely putting one together. I've been sort of drafting one up as the weeks go by. But, we don't have to spend more than 5 minutes on it, but just talk to people about the importance of a business plan and what they need to be considering as the major sort of aspects in it.
I think, especially for somebody who's going to look at financing part or all of their brewery operation, as soon as you go to the bank, they're going to ask you for a business plan. Okay. And the business plan is going to have to cover what you expect to pay for, what your premises is going to look like, how much your premises is going to cost, what you're looking for in the future in terms of beer production, and how that's going to tie back to paying off your loan. So these are the kinds of things. This is actually a new offering of ours. I've actually got a brewer on my books who was a brewery owner. He is a founder and owner of a brewery, and he's providing guidance and training for brewers wanting to start out in a new venture. So he does everything from capacity planning and startup through figuring out how big your brewery should be, what sort of premises you should have, how you go about putting in your development application submission, for instance. We'll talk through the business plan, branding, financing, cash flow projections, insurances, licensing, all that stuff, recipe development, brew sheet and process development. So all your SOPs, your standard operating procedures, brew day preparation, and he'll actually come and help you on your first brew day if that's part of what you need. Canning operations, and production. We provide guidance in all of these areas. We can the service into chunks, so we can put them into little packages of time, or we can charge it out on an hourly basis so that you have a little more control of your budget, I guess.
And that's great to hear, because I've done business plans in the past, not building a brewery related, but just knowing all the different sides of what you need to be considering. And even if you aren't going to a bank, you should still have a business plan. That's what other guests have said on the podcast, just to have it organized in your mind to paper as to exactly how you're going to roll this out.
It also has some goal setting in it. So, when you start out to something, you think you have something in your mind that says, oh, I'd like to do this and I'd like to do that and I'd like to do the other. And when you put it down on paper, you actually start to define it a bit better.
Yeah.
And once you've defined that, you can track it and see how your goals are going to, with time, and you can adjust your outlook. The trick is to be able to adjust your outlook, adjust your business plan as you go along, so that you get some sort of tracking mechanism, I guess, to see how successful you are, other than just straight numbers in the bank.
Yeah. I guess moving off all the sourcing equipment side of things and how to go about it, and there's some great advice there, Gav. I really do appreciate you sharing it with us. Many episodes before this one, I've always gotten the guests to share some of their industry insights. For brewery owners, it's talking about the future of the craft beer industry and beer trends, etc. But seeing how this episode is dedicated to the equipment side, I thought I'd get your take on, or maybe you can let us know of any new and exciting equipment coming onto the market, things that might be revolutionising the beer brewing industry, or things to improve automation or improve efficiency. Is there anything that's on your radar or that you've come across in your travels in the equipment supply industry?
There's some really cool machines out there. Obviously, with all this COVID thing, I haven't been to any trade shows recently. I don't think anybody has. There are some interesting things going on with production in the production line area. So all these little plastic things for carrying cans.
Yep.
Little plastic. And the eco-based ones as well. There's some machines out there that can make your life a whole lot easier. They're designed to really cut down probably a quarter to a half a body, I guess, in your production line by putting the Pactex plastic handles onto a 4-pack or a 6-pack, and also the eco packs as well. So once your can comes out of the filler and goes through the rinser and everything and the labels, it'll go out to a pack-off table where either somebody puts the Pactex plastic goodies on top and puts them into a carton, or you put it through this machine and it'll push out all 180 cans a minute, some of them, which is really cool, because then, the guy that's sitting on the end of that line can be doing something else. He can be either putting those packed cans into a carton and taking the carton, or pushing it through a carton machine and putting on a pallet. So you repurposing that role, I guess. And there's also a couple of things that are quite innovative when it comes to depalletizing. So I don't know if you've seen these great big depalletizers where you put a pallet on them, the lid pushes the pallet up to the top of the lid, and then it's got a little sweeper that sweeps a whole pallet, or probably a layer of cans off the pallet into a chute, and the chute goes down into the canning machine. They've got a half-height, although fully automated depalletizer that fits into really compact areas in some breweries, and that'll save a person moving away from one job in a production line and going to physically pick up cans off a layer and put them into a little whale tail chute, for instance. And that'll happen depending on how fast the canning machine is, it'll happen every sort of 5 minutes. He's got to walk away and go and do something else, and he's not watching what he was watching before. So it all takes labor costs away, and it gives time to people who are doing other more important operations to do those operations.
Yeah. Oh wow, and do you mentioned trade shows earlier? Is there any trade shows that you'd mention for some of our listeners to visit here in Australia? Obviously, when COVID finally pisses off, but when things where crowds are allowed back and expos and trade shows are humming along okay, can you recommend any for the listeners to go to?
Well, two that come to mind are CBC, so the Craft Beer Convention, and because they often have, always have a hall full of, machinery and people selling stuff, displaying. And the other one is, I think it's called, I don't know what it's called, it's like pack something, or other. That happens once every 2 years. And that's got a whole lot of packaging machinery in general. So, they do all sorts of bottling machines and blow packers and carton erectors and all sorts of things that beer people don't want to know about.
Yeah.
But that's not bad.
And any insights that you'd like to give on the future of the craft beer industry here in Australia?
Look, I think the craft beer industry is very strong in Australia. I think I firmly believe that, I'm seeing breweries pop up still once every few weeks. At one stage, there was a couple, there were two popping up every other week. And I have a fairly extensive database of breweries throughout Australia, and man, I'm adding to it every week. The only thing I would say is that you probably find that the only guys who fail are guys who probably have hit a glitch in their cash flow or business sense maybe, and because most people have, they make reasonable beers. But I will say that if you want to succeed, make sure your marketing's good. Marketing will sell anything. It doesn't matter what the product is. So just make sure that you've got a marketing strategy and you implement it.
Yeah, no, and that has been a reoccurring theme actually. Pete from Wayward mentioning if you don't want to have a business plan, that's fine, but make sure you have a marketing and product strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just on COVID, a lot of your suppliers are based in mainland China or overseas. So how has that affected your business with sourcing equipment from overseas?
So with China, they did when COVID first came out, they did have shutdowns. So they ended up being about 3 or 4 weeks of having 3 or 4 weeks of catch up in their production line when they came back online. But they caught up really quickly. So there hasn't been a problem really as far as the Chinese are concerned. In the US, funny enough, COVID has brought about an unprecedented amount of orders for canning machines, believe it or not. Because what's happening is, it's a kind of a knock-on effect. You have contract canners go up and they'll do canning runs and they'll go to the next customer, they go to the next customer, and you'll schedule your next canning run. Then you'll find that now with COVID, people are staying at home, so they're ordering beer online, and you need to get the beer out. You need to get it into cans, so you need your schedule to be updated, and they can't keep up with the schedule. So, a lot of brewers are saying, well, hey, if I can't get my beer out, I'm not selling. I'm gonna die. So I'll invest in a canning machine because then I can at least get the beer out, and I'm getting the volume. So it's this whole knock-on effect. And the guys the Twin Monkeys guys in the States have actually had to put on extra teams, and they've had to reshuffle their business a little bit to do some catch-up as well with the demand. Other than taking a little longer to get a machine built because it's sitting in a queue, we're working on other things to expedite the delivery, such as air freight. So I'm working with the guys at Twin Monkeys to make sure that their crates, when they crate the machines up, they crate them to a certain specific size so it fits in a part of the aircraft that doesn't cost as much as like a main deck, for instance. Yeah, it's another part of shipping that I've just learned about, which is really interesting. So, and then air freight ends up being cheaper and quicker. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah. And the COVID side of things, like it's affected people so many different ways. Like I know, and I can imagine why canning lines are so in demand now because, a lot of the brewery owners I've met with are saying, well, that pivot from kegs to cans, to pubs are shut, they can't move their beer. They're transferring all their beer from kegs to cans. So those first couple of months, like people were able to flip 180 within the first week. I think Pat from Willie the Boatman mentioned that they went from kegs to cans within a week, everything from kegs to cans. Chris from East Coast Canning was saying, they're busier than ever. So it just goes to show you how COVID's affected everything and people's perspective on it business-wise. Well, thanks again, Gav, for coming on the Build Me a Brewery podcast, discussing the equipment sourcing side of things. It's been really insightful. I think the listeners will get a lot out of it. I know I have. Any final closing thoughts or advice you'd like to mention?
I'll say it again. Don't rush into anything. Just make sure you do your homework and talk to people. So it's your hard-earned cash. Just spend it wisely.
So, and I guess finally, where can people and how can people reach you?
Before we go into that, can I give a plug to some people?
Yeah, absolutely, mate.
So what I would like to do is give a big shout out to a couple of people who have gone the extra mile without prejudice to pretty much get me where I am now. And one of the guys is Dave Ward from Ether Brewing in Virginia. So that's Ether, AETHER. He's down tools on a couple of occasions, even with his own business commitments to help me when I was stuck. And I just can't hold that at all. And the same goes for Matt Yankuskas from Brewery up in Malani. always helpful, always going the extra mile. Can't fault it.
Well, maybe we can, haven't really got as organised as I should, but with all our show notes, I'm putting in links and plugs that's discussed in the episode. So maybe off air you can sort of send me some of those links and I can make sure that they're in the show notes for people to easily visit. Yeah, was that all you wanted to mention in closing thoughts and plug?
Just really have a look around our website. We have a lot to offer, and we're still working on our SEO. Our website's just been revamped, so we're not as visible as I'd like to be, but we're out there.
Excellent. So that's and what's the web address, Gav?
It is www.synergycustomsolutions.com. We're also on Facebook. If you look for brewing and distilling equipment, all one word, and on Instagram, so brewing and distilling equipment on Instagram as well. And we operate all over Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific. So we have a big reach.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Gavin, and I do appreciate you coming on. Everyone, that was Gavin van Vurren from Synergy Custom Solutions. Thanks, Gav.
You're very welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for inviting me, and you're doing a great job.
Thanks for listening to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. That concludes our brewery equipment sourcing segment. The next segment, we move into raw materials and ingredient suppliers, where we talk all things hops, malts, and yeast for the commercial brewing world. As always, if you are liking the podcast so far and find the content useful, please give us a follow and rating on whatever platform you're listening on. Also, follow us on all our social media handles, as well as visiting our website, www.buildmeabrewery.com.au, and much more complimentary content will be coming your way if you sign up to our mailing list. I'm Chris Hayton, your host, and this is the Build Me a Brewery podcast.